Have you ever wondered, is greed your enemy or is it your weapon? May 18th, 1986, Berkeley, California. The graduation ceremony sunlight caught the speaker's suit as he stood at the podium. His name was Ivan Boesky at the time, the most dazzling arbitrage star on Wall Street, with a net worth exceeding $200 million. He stood on that stage, facing thousands of young business school graduates, and spoke the words that would go down in Wall Street history. Greed is all right. I want you to know this. I think greed is healthy. You can be greedy and still feel good about yourself. The room erupted in applause. No one knew that the man on stage, preaching his philosophy of greed, had already crossed a line that no one could see. That same year, 3,000 kilometers away, every morning at 4:30, Michael Milken would arrive at his Beverly Hills office without fail. His trading desk was shaped like an X, with him seated at the center, surrounded by the never-ending ringing of phones. That year, his personal annual salary, $5.5 billion a year, the highest paycheck on all of Wall Street. They called him the junk bond king. Meanwhile, in Omaha, a far more modest little city in the Midwest, another man was quietly poring over the annual report of a lumber company. His name was Buffett. Same era of greed, same pursuit of wealth, same razor-sharp mind. Why did Boesky's greed ultimately earn him a pair of handcuffs? Why did Milken's tools reshape the history of finance, yet also shatter the lives of countless people? And why was Buffett able to carve out a completely different path in an era defined by the same greed? This is not a story about stocks, nor is it a story about fraud. This is a story about boundaries. Welcome to the Soft Crash. I'm Fanko. Today, we're going to step into the world of investment philosophy through the minds of three of the sharpest thinkers at the very top of the game. The story begins in 1954 at 52 Wall Street, New York City. (1954), New York, 52 Wall Street. Inside an unremarkable office building sat a small investment firm called Graham Newman Corporation. The office was small, the staff was lean, but every single day they did the same thing: hunt for cheap money. And this was where Buffett came to work. Annual salary, $12,000. Age, 24. His boss was Benjamin Graham, the man who would later be called the father of securities analysis. Buffett had once applied to Harvard Business School and got rejected. He turned to Columbia University instead, and that's where he discovered Graham was teaching. He once described the feeling of reading Graham's work for the first time. It was like seeing the light. Working under Graham was something Buffett had dreamed of his entire life. But the first truly valuable thing he learned at Graham Newman wasn't some grand principle about value investing. It was a single word: arbitrage. Arbitrage, the word itself, in its original sense, means profiting from price differences. At Graham Newman, arbitrage referred primarily to a strategy known as merger arbitrage. The logic is simple. When Company A announces it will acquire Company B at $50 per share, but Company B's stock is only trading at $47. There's a $3 spread right there. If the deal goes through, you buy in at $47, collect $50 when it closes, and pocket $3 clean and simple. This is not speculation, not gambling, not a bet on market sentiment. This is earning a reasonable, near certain spread in the course of a real business event unfolding before your eyes. The core lesson Graham taught Buffett came down to a single point: act only within the range of what you can calculate with clarity. Only make the deals you can truly see through. Only place your bets when the odds are clearly in your favor. never chase higher returns by taking on risks you truly cannot afford to lose. It sounds like simple wisdom. But on Wall Street in 1954, very few people could actually live by it. In the very year Buffett joined Graham Newman, he came across the first arbitrage case that truly excited him. The company was called Rockwood & Co. In 1954, Rockwood found itself sitting on a hot potato. This company, which specialized in cocoa bean processing, had stockpiled a massive inventory of cocoa beans. These beans were originally meant for chocolate production, not to be used as investment assets. But that very year, something strange happened in the international cocoa bean market. The futures price of cocoa butter skyrocketed. Cocoa butter is the fat extracted from cocoa beans, and it's the core ingredient in chocolate. That year, its price shot up from 5 cents a pound all the way to 60 cents a pound. A 12-fold increase. Lockwood was sitting on a pile of raw materials that had suddenly become enormously valuable, and yet he couldn't bring himself to feel happy about it. Because American tax law stipulated that selling those cocoa beans outright would trigger a hefty capital gains tax. But if the cocoa beans were treated as an asset and used to exchange for the company's own stock, the transaction would be tax-exempt. Lockwood then issued an announcement. The company was willing to exchange cocoa beans for shares held by its stockholders at a conversion rate pegged to the prevailing market price of 60 cents per pound. That announcement caught Buffett's eye. He started doing the math. At the time, Rockwood's stock was trading at around $34 a share. He did the math: how many pounds of cocoa beans could each share be exchanged for, and what were those beans worth on the open market? He ran the numbers, and the answer was clear. It was a good deal. The strategy was straightforward. Buy Rockwood shares on the open market, immediately tender them back to the company in exchange for cocoa beans. At the same time, short cocoa futures on the commodity market to lock in that 60-cent price. Every single round of this trade captured a clean, reliable spread. No gambling involved, no variables left to guess, just precise calculations and swift execution. Buffett personally made trip after trip to the company's counter, exchanging his shares for cocoa beans, then turning around and selling those beans for cash. He later recalled riding the bus back and forth across New York City, clutching one delivery receipt after another in his hands. It was the first time he truly felt the thrill Graham had described, using your mind to make money with certainty. But Graham Newman taught him more than just how to make money. More importantly, this kind of money, you could actually earn it, and you could earn it clean. No insider tips, no cutting corners, just taking all the publicly available information and doing the math more carefully than everyone else. This lesson stayed with Buffett for the rest of his life. After leaving Graham Newman, he set out on his own to manage money independently. Arbitrage became a regular strategy in his portfolio, not to chase windfall profits, but to keep his capital working while he waited for the right opportunities to come along, while keeping risk under control. In 1988, in his letter to Berkshire Hathaway shareholders, he devoted an entire section to the subject of arbitrage. In it, he referenced a case from 1981 that revealed a deeper dimension to the logic of arbitrage. The company was called Arcata. Arcata Corporation, headquartered in California, was a timber company. It owned 77,500 acres of timberland, including a stretch of extraordinarily precious coastal redwood forest. In 1978, the U.S. federal government, in an effort to protect this redwood forest, forcibly acquired 10,700 acres of the land, paying approximately $97.9 million in compensation. But the government and Pacific Lumber's parent company, Arcata, had a fundamental disagreement over the value of this land. The government believed $97.9 million was more than fair. Arcata's lawyers disagreed, not even close. And so, the battle went to court. In 1981, KKR, at the time Wall Street's most prominent leveraged buyout firm, made a takeover bid with the intention of acquiring Arcata outright. Buffett took notice of the deal. He opened up Arcata's annual reports, studying the lawsuit over the redwood forests and the details of KKR's acquisition structure. He saw two separate angles to play. The first one was the arbitrage spread that would close once KKR completed the acquisition. Once the acquisition closed, anyone holding Headwaters stock would walk away with a guaranteed cash-out price. The second piece was even more interesting, that government compensation lawsuit over the redwood forests was still unresolved. If they ultimately won the case, the former Arcata shareholders would be entitled to additional compensation, a hidden option buried beneath the surface of the deal. A detail most people would skip right past when flipping through an annual report. Buffett didn't skip it. He and Berkshire spent a combined $22,900,000 to acquire 655,000 shares of Arcata. The merger ultimately went through, and the lawsuit over the redwood forest finally reached its conclusion years later. The U.S. federal court ruled that the government's initial compensation had severely undervalued the redwood forest and ordered additional payment plus interest that far exceeded expectations. Additional compensation per share, $29.48. On his 655,000 shares, Buffett received an additional approximately $19.3 million. All in, the internal rate of return on this investment, 39%. This is the complete picture of Buffett's arbitrage logic. No betting on market direction, no wagering on sentiment, no relying on information that others don't have access to. Instead, find a clear corporate event, calculate every documentable value within it, put your money in, and wait for the outcome to land. The line Graham taught him never changed in 30 years. Only place your bet within the boundaries of what you can clearly see and understand. But in that same era, there were two other men on Wall Street, studying the very same tools. They saw the same opportunities. They made a completely different choice. July 4th, 1946, Encino, California. On the very day America was celebrating its Independence Day, a new baby was born into the Milken family. They named him Michael. No one could have known that this boy, born into the crack of firecrackers and the blaze of fireworks, would one day ignite a financial revolution on Wall Street as seismic as the War of Independence itself. Milken's father was an accountant. From an early age, Milken would sit alongside his father, helping him work through the books. Not just playing around, he was genuinely involved, doing the calculations, helping his father organize tax returns for clients. By the age of 10, Milken could already read and understand financial statements. He went on to the University of California, Berkeley. This was the mid-1960s. At Berkeley, he had two classmates who would both go on to become household names. One was Michael Ovitz, who later became the most powerful talent agent in Hollywood. The other was Sally Field, who later became an Academy Award-winning actress. But what truly changed Milken's fate was not any single person. It was an academic paper written in 1958. The author's name was W. Braddock Hickman. This study, titled Corporate Bond Quality and Investor Experience, documented the historical performance data of hundreds of corporate bonds from 1900 to 1943. Hickman discovered a conclusion that overturned everything people believed at the time. Those bonds labeled as low credit grade, what would later be known as junk bonds over the long run, after accounting for default losses, actually delivered higher overall returns over the long run than bonds considered safe, the high-grade ones. There is only one reason for this: the market's pricing of risk tends to be excessively pessimistic. People were so terrified of the word junk that these bonds became systematically undervalued. For someone who had studied accounting and knew how to read numbers, this logic was transparent at a glance. Milken saw right through it. In the Berkeley Library, he went through Hickman's research again and again. He began to believe that low-grade bonds were assets the market had fundamentally misunderstood. Find them, price them right, and sell them to buyers bold enough to take on the risk. There was a gold mine buried in all of this. In 1969, Milken joined Drexel Burnham Lambert, a middling Wall Street investment bank. At first he was just an intern, then a young clerk handling bond trading at the firm, but he quickly discovered that no one at Drexel truly understood low-grade bonds. This was his moment. He began making calls by the hundreds, visiting small and mid-sized businesses that had been overlooked by the major institutions, helping them issue bonds. Then he sold those bonds to savings institutions and insurance companies hungry for higher yields. Trading volume began to skyrocket. In 1971, he was promoted to head of the bond trading division. In 1978, his father was diagnosed with melanoma. Milken made a decision to move his entire team from New York to Beverly Hills, California, to be closer to his father. Drexel agreed. 9560 Wilshire Boulevard, Beverly Hills. This address would become one of the most mysterious power centers on Wall Street throughout the 1980s. Milken's trading desk was shaped like an X. He sat at the center of that X, surrounded on all sides by his traders and salespeople, the phones never stopping. He arrived at the office every morning at 4:30, a full 3 hours before the New York markets opened, already working the phones in the pre-dawn darkness. The speed at which he made calls was said to be so fast that the person on the other end never had a chance to say no. In 1987, his personal annual compensation reached $550 million. Not company revenue. That was what one single person took home in a single year. Every year, Drexel would host a private annual conference in Beverly Hills. Insiders called it the Predators Ball. The guest list included Frank Sinatra, Diana Ross, and the biggest institutional investors and corporate CEOs from across the country. To attend this ball was to gain entry into a circle where more than money changed hands. Power moved through it too. What Milken did, in the simplest terms, was this. He used junk bonds to provide financing for companies that couldn't otherwise borrow money. It sounds dry, but its impact was nothing short of revolutionary. Before this, the big banks would only lend money to companies that were already wealthy. Asset-rich giants could secure financing with ease, while smaller companies, those with low credit ratings, full of potential but not yet proven, couldn't borrow a dime. Milken changed the rules of the game. He helped companies deemed unworthy of credit issue high-yield bonds, then sold those bonds to investors willing to take on greater risk in exchange for greater returns. A neglected market had been reopened by him. MCI Communications, fueled by Milken's bonds, grew from a second-tier telephone company into a formidable rival to AT&T. Turner Broadcasting used this money to build CNN. Time Warner, Marriott Hotels, both were once Milken's clients. From 1979 to 1988, the U.S. leveraged buyout market grew from $13 billion to $77 billion. In just 9 years, nearly a six-fold increase. The enormous capital fueling this expansion came largely from the junk bonds Milken issued. The instrument itself was neutral. Just like a knife can cook a meal or draw blood, junk bonds could help small companies that had been cast aside by the traditional financial system find a way forward. They could also be used to do something else entirely, to forcibly tear apart large corporations that had absolutely no desire to be taken over. target large companies with substantial assets but undervalued stock prices, buy them out, break them apart, sell off the pieces, pay down the debt, and walk away with the cash. This model had a more common name: predatory takeover. Hollywood captured it in a 1987 film with a character named Gordon Gekko. Gekko had a line in the film that echoed Boesky's words almost perfectly. Greed, for lack of a better word, is good. The character Gordon Gekko was modeled after both Boesky and Milken. Boesky was 9 years older than Milken, born on March 6, 1937, in Detroit. His father ran restaurants and bars. In the eyes of his wife's family, he was a complete and utter failure, a man they nicknamed Ivan the Bum. In 1966, at the age of 29, Boesky finally set foot on Wall Street, for the first time only through the connections of his wife's family. His starting point was far less glamorous than the legend that would follow. But he had a rare gift. He could turn information into money. In that era, merger arbitrage was, by its nature, a legitimate strategy built on publicly available information. Just like Buffett did scan the public merger announcements, calculate the spread, buy in, and wait for the outcome, Boesky was doing arbitrage too. But the way he played arbitrage was nothing like Buffett. Buffett worked the numbers in the filings. Boesky wanted the information before the filings ever came out. In 1975, Boesky used $700,000 from his wife's family to found his own firm, and then he began to spin his web. He cultivated inside sources at major investment banks, people who could pass him intelligence on mergers and acquisitions before any official announcement was made. Boesky would receive the tip, buy shares in the target company ahead of the announcement, then sell once the news went public and the stock price surged, pocketing the profits. This pattern ran for 10 years. The fortune kept growing. In 1982, he lost roughly $60 million on a single arbitrage deal, nearly wiping him out completely. But he didn't stop. He simply leaned harder on inside information. Keep buying, keep selling, keep rolling. On May 18th, 1986, he delivered the commencement address at Berkeley. His net worth had already surpassed $200 million. Greed is healthy. He didn't just say it for effect. He truly believed it. But 6 months after those words were spoken, on November 14th, 1986, that empire came crashing down. That day would later be known on Wall Street as Boesky Day. The SEC announced that Boesky had reached a settlement on insider trading charges, agreeing to pay $100 million in fines and accepting a lifetime ban from the securities industry. $200 million in net worth. A decade-long empire. One declaration: greed is healthy. In the end, all of it traded away for a lifetime ban and a pair of handcuffs. What did Boesky do wrong? The answer is simple. He crossed the line. A line every market participant knows is there. Buffett was operating in the same era, running the same kind of business called arbitrage. He made money. He never crossed that line. Not because he didn't know where the line was. It was because he chose not to cross it. Some people see a boundary and find a way around it. Others see that same boundary and stay on this side. That is what a boundary means. And now we're entering the most complicated part of this story, because the truth is, Buffett was greedy too. October 1988, New York. A piece of news exploded across Wall Street. R.J.R. Nabisco, one of America's largest tobacco and food conglomerates, the parent company of Camel cigarettes, the most iconic cigarette brand outside of Marlboro, the parent company of Oreo cookies and Ritz crackers, announced that its CEO Ross Johnson, together with a Wall Street investment bank, was planning a leveraged buyout at $75 per share, at a total price of roughly $17 billion, to launch a management buyout, taking this publicly traded company private and putting it straight into his own pocket. The moment this news broke, everyone understood one thing: RJR Nabisco was going up for sale, and $75 a share was nowhere near its true value. The feast had begun. KKR jumped in. First Boston jumped in. Time Warner jumped in. Round after round, the bids kept climbing. $75, $90, $101, $108, $109. This takeover battle would later be called by the media the deal of the century, was immortalized in a book called Barbarians at the Gate, becoming the most defining footnote of that era of greed. In the end, KKR won the battle at $109 per share. Total deal size, approximately $31.3 billion. In 1988, the largest leveraged buyout in human history, of that $31.3 billion. Where did the vast majority come from? Junk bonds. Milken's machine was pushed to its absolute limits in this deal. But to understand the logic behind this bidding war, you first have to understand the kind of man Ross Johnson was. The CEO of RJR Nabisco. Johnson was famously extravagant. Under his leadership, RJR Nabisco had built up a massive fleet of corporate jets. The company originally had 6 aircraft, and Johnson went on to order 2 Gulfstream G4S at $21 million apiece. To house these aircraft, he allocated another $12 million to build a brand new hangar. This private fleet was jokingly nicknamed Air Johnson by insiders at the company. And the planes weren't just used for business travel. Sports stars, team players, and Johnson's personal friends were all frequent guests aboard. According to documented records, there was even one occasion when Johnson's beloved German Shepherd bit a security guard, and to prevent the dog from being seized and quarantined by local authorities, he dispatched a vice president to accompany the dog, quietly flying it out on the company jet, and the name logged in the corporate flight records was simply G. Shepherd. This kind of extravagance is the key to understanding the entire story. It was precisely this kind of reckless executive spending that drove RJR Nabisco's stock price far below what it was truly worth. The interests of shareholders had been systematically diluted by management's personal indulgences, and Johnson's management buyout proposal was, in essence, the management team discovering this undervalued asset and plotting to cut shareholders out, entirely pocketing the gains for themselves. That's exactly why, the moment KKR stepped in, they immediately knew they could offer a higher price. Not because they had uncovered some hidden secret, but because once management's extravagance was stripped away, this company was simply worth more. And while this battle was unfolding, Buffett, sitting far away in Omaha, had his eyes fixed on this deal. What did he see? He saw a classic arbitrage opportunity. On the day Ross Johnson announced the management buyout, RJR Nabisco stock was still trading below $75 a share, but everyone knew the final price of this bidding war would land far higher than that. That was the spread. That was the arbitrage opportunity. Buffett later wrote in his 1988 shareholder letter that Berkshire Hathaway's arbitrage positions that year were unusually large, and the biggest single position among them was RJR Nabisco. He bought in, but he wasn't acting on inside information, and he wasn't amplifying his bets with leverage. What he used was the method he learned from Graham, seeing clearly the game structure of the deal, judging the probability that the acquisition would ultimately go through, calculate the gap between the entry price and the expected payout price, then buy in and wait for the outcome. For Buffett, The analytical logic behind this trade was crystal clear. Multiple well-resourced bidders had already entered the arena, and this battle was not going to fizzle out without a resolution. The floor was set by management's bid, and the ceiling was determined by how much KKR could raise. Both variables were public information. He didn't need anyone to tip him off. His involvement and Boesky's involvement may have looked like the same thing. In substance, they were worlds apart. Boesky's involvement in the RJR arbitrage was backed by inside information. Buffett's involvement in the same deal relied entirely on publicly available information that anyone could have seen. This is the true meaning of the phrase, "Buffett is greedy too." He is greedy. He craved wealth, pursued returns, and never backed down when a great opportunity stood before him. But his greed, it always stayed on the right side of that line. Also in 1988, Buffett did something else, something that reveals the true nature of his greed far more clearly than the RJR Nabisco arbitrage ever could. He started buying Coca-Cola. Not a little bit. He poured a substantial portion of Berkshire Hathaway's available capital that year into Coca-Cola. In 1988 alone, he put in roughly $600 million. By the end of 1989, his total accumulated investment had surpassed $1 billion. Everyone was asking, why now? Coca-Cola was a century-old giant. Its stock wasn't cheap, and its growth potential had already been calculated and recalculated by analysts from every angle. So where exactly was the opportunity? To answer that question, we need to go back 3 years. On April 23, 1985, the Coca-Cola Company made a historic mistake. They changed the formula. The new drink was rebranded as New Coke. The company's market research showed that in blind taste tests, people preferred the new flavor. They believed this would be a successful upgrade. Instead, it turned into a public relations disaster. Consumers weren't just drinking a beverage, they were drinking a memory, a culture, an emotional bond. The formula was never really the product the brand was. And change the formula, and you've changed something deep inside them. Complaint calls and letters came flooding in like a tidal wave. 79 days later, on the 11th of July 1985, Coca-Cola announced the return of its original formula, rebranding it as Coca-Cola Classic. This failure, however, made the company's CEO Roberto Goizueta realize something. The brand value of Coca-Cola was far more powerful than they had ever imagined. Goizueta then made a pivotal strategic shift. He began selling off the bottling operations, transferring them to independent bottlers. The Coca-Cola Company would focus on just two things: syrup and brand. It was an incredibly asset-light model. No need to build factories, no need to manage logistics, just sell the syrup formula and the marketing. By 1988, Coca-Cola's return on equity had more than doubled compared to 1981, and the international market had only just begun. At that time, the vast populations of China, India, and Southeast Asia had barely been introduced to Coca-Cola. Global per capita consumption was only a small fraction of what Americans were drinking. What Buffett saw was not a company that had already peaked, but a brand that was taking flight all over again, along with a global market that had yet to be fully tapped. In his letter to shareholders, he used a specific phrase, consumer franchise, meaning there are certain brands that can sell without cutting prices, that stay in people's minds without advertising. No need to worry about competitors, because consumers simply won't switch away. This kind of franchise, this is the source of pricing power, and it is the very essence of a moat. The Coca-Cola Company, he wrote, possesses an incredible competitive position, one that will endure for a very long time. This is not an opportunity, this is a gift. And in that moment, Buffett's greed revealed itself in full. When he saw the gift, he reached out and took it without a second thought. By 1994, that initial investment of $1.02 billion had grown to a market value of over $4.6 billion. 6 years, more than 4 times over. This is why, in the same greedy era, among people who hungered equally for wealth, some ended up walking paths that could not have been more different. Buffett's greed made him one of the wealthiest men in the world. Boesky's greed landed him in prison. Between the two, what separated them was not intelligence, not luck, not resources. All that stood between them was that one line. The 29th of March, 1989. Federal Court, New York City. Michael Milken was hit with 98 federal criminal charges. The charges spanned securities fraud, racketeering, insider trading, price manipulation, and aiding Boesky in illegal operations. 98 counts. That number was unprecedented at the time. The day the news broke, Drexel Burnham Lambert's stock price collapsed right at the opening bell. Drexel's clients, those companies that had relied on Milken's junk bonds for financing, began to panic. The junk bond market started cooling at a rapid pace. The entire leveraged empire of the 1980s felt the ground begin to shake beneath its feet. So, how did Milken get caught? The answer takes us back to the aftermath of Boesky Day. On the 14th of November, 1986, after reaching a settlement with the SEC, Boesky signed a cooperation agreement. Cooperation meant betrayal. Boesky began cooperating with federal investigators. He provided critical evidence, including specific details of numerous illegal arrangements between himself and Milken. Among these arrangements, there was a practice known as parking. Parking meant that Boesky would hold a certain stock, while Milken's side would secretly guarantee that Boesky wouldn't take any losses. On the surface, it looked like Boesky was making ordinary stock trades. But in reality, Milken was absorbing the risk on Boesky's behalf, while the two split the profits between them. This was systematic fraud. The testimony and recordings provided by Boesky gave the SEC concrete footing in its investigation into Drexel, Burnham, Lambert, and Milken. The investigation dragged on for more than 2 years. In December 1988, Drexel Burnham Lambert reached a settlement with the government, agreeing to pay $650 million in fines. This was the largest single fine in the history of American securities law at the time, but it was only a prelude. On the 13th of February, 1990, Drexel Burnham Lambert filed for bankruptcy protection. A firm that had once surpassed Goldman Sachs to claim the top spot on Wall Street's profit rankings collapsed completely less than a year after the indictment was handed down. An era had officially come to an end. On the 24th of April 1990, Milken made a decision. He would plead guilty. Not to all 98 counts, just 6, including securities fraud and aiding others in illegal trading. That November, the court handed down its verdict. The presiding judge was Kimba Wood, known for her iron fist. The sentence, 10 years in prison, plus over $1 billion in fines and restitution. Back in 1987, Milken had earned $550 million in a single year. $1 billion, nearly 2 years' worth of his earnings, and the end of most of his fortune. He served 22 months in federal prison. On January 2nd, 1993, he walked out of the prison gates. That same month, a doctor handed him a diagnosis: prostate cancer, PSA level 24. The doctors told him that, given the medical standards of the time, he might have 1 to 2 years left. But before we dive deep into Milken's story, There's a chapter of history that needs to be told, one that very few people have ever connected to Milken. In the 1980s, American savings and loan institutions, commonly known as S&Ls, were permitted, following deregulation, to invest in higher-risk assets. A flood of savings and loan associations rushed to buy Milken's junk bonds. The logic was simple. High yields, backed by a powerhouse like Drexel, it looked like a sure thing. The most aggressive of them all was an institution called Columbia Savings and Loan. It held as much as $4 billion in junk bonds, making it the single largest junk bond holder among all savings and loan institutions in the entire country. Another one was called Lincoln Savings and Loan, which was acquired by Charles Keating, and the money Keating used to acquire it came directly from Milken's junk bonds, raised through Drexel. In 1989, Milken was indicted, and the junk bond market collapsed. The savings and loan institutions that had loaded up on junk bonds watched their assets rapidly shrink in value and soon found themselves insolvent. Over 1,000 savings and loan institutions collapsed in succession from the late 1980s through the early 1990s. The U.S. government was forced to launch the largest financial institution bailout in history in order to protect depositors' savings. The total cost of cleaning up the entire savings and loan crisis was estimated at over $160 billion. The ordinary people who had deposited their savings in those institutions, the community banks that had lent money to small businesses, the elderly who had spent a lifetime carefully saving every penny in their accounts, they were the ones left holding the bill for this game of greed. This was the real price paid in the real world for Milken's tools. Not some abstract harm to market fairness, not some theoretical systemic risk, but real families, one by one, suffering real losses. A philosophy of greed proclaimed from the trading desks of Wall Street. The price paid by people hundreds of miles away who had never heard of junk bonds. But Milken didn't follow the script the doctors had written for him. He survived, and after his release from prison, he began doing something that surprised a lot of people. He took that same logic and applied it to prostate cancer research. Find where the funding allocation breaks down, deploy capital, and demand results. He established the Prostate Cancer Research Foundation and began funding research directions that had been overlooked by mainstream medical institutions. He organized academic summits, pulling together top oncologists, biotech investors, and pharmaceutical executives into the same room, using the same matchmaking logic he once applied to the Predators Ball in Beverly Hills. He brought medicine and capital together. He also changed his diet, published a cookbook focused on cancer prevention, and advocated for early prostate cancer screening. He lived until 2020. On the 18th of February, 2020, President Donald Trump officially granted a full pardon to Michael Milken. 30 years of legal stigma wiped away with a single pardon. In his shareholder letters from the 1980s, Buffett wrote an observation that rarely gets quoted but is remarkably precise. He observed that much of the financial activity of that era was not about creating value, but about transferring it from one pocket to another. The buyers would crush the target company, leaving workers unemployed, suppliers cut off, and debt piling up. Then, the sellers would cash out and walk away, leaving all the costs to those who never had a seat at the table. This is not greed. This is plunder. Greed, at its core, is I want more. Plunder, at its core, means my gain comes at your loss. Between the two, there is a clear and unmistakable line. What Boesky said in 1986 wasn't wrong in itself. He simply failed to understand what truly healthy greed looks like. And next, we're going to look at 1991, when Buffett faced the biggest crisis of his career and how he handled it. That crisis had a name: Salomon Brothers. The 9th of August, 1991, New York City. A bomb went off inside the headquarters of Salomon Brothers. Salomon Brothers, one of the most powerful investment banks in America at the time, whose operations dominated the trading of U.S. Treasury bonds. This market was one of the largest financial markets in the world, directly tied to the cost of financing for the United States government, and serves as the pricing benchmark for trillions of dollars in assets around the world. Buffett and Berkshire Hathaway were among Salomon Brothers' largest individual shareholders, holding approximately $700 million in preferred stock, representing a stake of roughly 19%. But now that $700 million was on the verge of evaporating, here's what happened. Salomon Brothers had a star trader named Paul Moser who headed the government bond trading desk. There was a rule governing U.S. Treasury auctions. In any single auction, no one entity could purchase more than 35% of the total offering. This rule was designed to prevent market monopolization and protect the integrity of Treasury auctions. What Moser did was submit false bids in his clients' names without their knowledge. On the surface, multiple investors appeared to be placing bids, but in reality, he had quietly seized total control for himself. This was no oversight. This was deliberate misconduct. Even more damning, the company's management had already discovered the problem back in April of 1991, yet they failed to report it to regulators in time. For 4 full months, they chose silence. And that silence turned what could have been a contained setback into a full-blown systemic crisis. In August, the story broke wide open. The U.S. Treasury Department delivered its harshest verdict yet. Salomon Brothers would be barred from the Treasury bond auction market. What does it mean for an investment bank whose core business is bonds to be banned from the Treasury auction market? It means the heart of the operation cut off. Just like that. It meant death. The ban was announced on the afternoon of Friday, August 16, 1991. That afternoon, as the news broke, Salomon's stock price plummeted. Employees were gripped with panic, and clients began calling in to ask whether their positions were safe. Salomon's board of directors made a decision that weekend. They asked Buffett to step in as interim chairman and CEO. He said yes. That weekend marked the turning point of the entire crisis. Buffett immediately flew to New York. The first thing he did was not call a press conference, not have a team of lawyers draft a statement. He picked up the phone and called U.S. Treasury Secretary Nicholas Brady directly. It was a Sunday phone call. His words were later recounted by multiple people who were there. "Secretary, I'm not here to make excuses. I'm not here to defend anyone. I'm here to tell you what we're going to do." He made a promise: full cooperation with the investigation, complete disclosure of information, no cover-ups of any kind. He staked his personal reputation as a guarantee. After this call, Brady made a pivotal decision: to grant Salomon a conditional exemption. The firm could no longer bid at Treasury auctions for its own account, but it could still participate on behalf of its clients. It was a lifeline, thin as a thread, almost negligible, but just enough to keep the firm from dying on the spot. That Monday morning, Buffett walked into Salomon's offices and officially took charge as interim chairman and CEO. The first decisions he made were simple and straightforward. He immediately called for full, open communication with regulators. No barriers, no filtering through lawyers, just direct meetings. He also called the Federal Reserve Chairman directly to convey the same message. Senior executives involved in the matter, including those who had known about it in April and chosen to stay silent, left the company. He sent a memo to all employees. In that memo, one line would go on to be widely quoted: "I can lose money that I can understand, but I will not tolerate losing even a shred of our reputation." This was not a line performed for the outside world. He said it to every single person working there. From this point forward, Solomon must redefine its own boundaries. He served in an interim role at Salomon for roughly 9 months. During that time, he drew no salary whatsoever. On the 4th of September, 1991, Buffett walked into a hearing room on Capitol Hill to appear before a special House committee hearing. The members of Congress took turns pressing him with hard questions. Exactly where had Solomon broken the rules? How much did management know? Why did it take 4 months to report? He defended no one. In the end, Solomon reached a settlement with the U.S. government, paying roughly $290 million in fines and civil penalties. Paul Moser, the trader who initiated the fraudulent bids, was sentenced to 4 months in prison. John Gutfreund, the former CEO who chose to stay silent after discovering the violations, was permanently banned from serving in any managerial role at a securities firm. Under Buffett's stewardship, Salomon stabilized. In 1997, Travelers Group acquired Salomon Brothers for approximately $9.3 billion. The preferred shares held by Berkshire Hathaway came through the crisis fully intact and ultimately turned a profit. The Salomon Brothers chapter stands as a unique footnote in Buffett's career. This was not his most profitable investment, nor was it even a decision he took the most pride in. But it is the moment in this entire story that best illustrates one thing. When you find yourself standing near a line, not because you want to cross it, but when you're forced to defend that line instead of cross it, what do? Boesky's answer was to keep pushing the boundary further and further out until it simply ceased to exist. Milken's choice was to find the cracks in that line and quietly slip through them. Buffett's choice was to stand his ground and redraw that line clearly. This crisis also taught Buffett something he would return to again and again in the years that followed. When an institution faces a crisis of trust, the most critical variable is not the scale of the crisis itself, but rather the speed and sincerity of the response. Solomon's 4 months of silence caused far greater damage than Moser's misconduct itself. Because a violation can be explained away as an individual mistake, but silence signals that the institution, when faced with a conflict of interest, chose self-preservation over honesty. Once that signal is sent, it is nearly impossible to take back. And the phone call Buffett made that Sunday, that line, "I'm calling to tell you what we're going to do," sent exactly the opposite signal. This time, we choose honesty. And that phone call, made directly to the Secretary of the Treasury on a Sunday afternoon, worked because the man who picked up believed in the man calling. That trust was not built in a single day. It was reputational capital that Buffett had accumulated over decades, one action at a time. That was the most valuable thing he brought into Salomon. Not money, not wisdom, not connections, reputation. If you ask Buffett what his most important competitive advantage is, he won't say it's his ability to pick stocks. He won't say it's his understanding of financial statements. He wouldn't say it's the scale of capital. He would say it's character. At first, that answer sounds like a modest platitude. But if you think about it carefully, it's the most central insight in this entire story. Was Boesky smart? Absolutely. Was Milken smart? Without question, he was one of the smartest men on Wall Street in that era. But intelligence couldn't save them, because intelligence only helps you see the opportunity. But character that determines how you handle the opportunities you know, deep down, you should never touch. In 1999, at the height of the dot-com bubble frenzy, Buffett sat down for an interview with Businessweek. At the time, he was widely mocked from all sides. Buffett's lost his touch. Value investing is dead. He doesn't understand the internet. In that interview, Buffett said something that stands as his most concrete explanation of the word character: the connection between investment, success, and intelligence is not as strong as you might think. Once your intelligence exceeds a certain basic threshold, what truly makes the difference is your ability to control the impulses that get other people into trouble. When he said this, the Nasdaq was still climbing toward its all-time high. 3 months later, the bubble began to burst. The Nasdaq ultimately fell nearly 80% from its peak. He came through unscathed. Buffett has a concept he calls the inner scorecard versus the outer scorecard. He said, people can be divided into two kinds. One type of person lives by an external scorecard: how others evaluate you, what score society gives you, whether the people around you look up to you with envy. That's what drives every decision they make. The other kind lives by an internal scorecard. You yourself know whether what you're doing is right or wrong, and your own judgment is the ultimate standard by which you act. He said the most typical example of someone living by an internal scorecard that he had ever encountered was his own father, Howard Buffett. Howard had served 4 terms as a Republican congressman in the United States House of Representatives, representing the state of Nebraska from 1943 to 1949, 1951 to 1953. He was known for his independent political stance, not the rhetorical kind, but the kind that led him to actually cast votes against the majority at critical moments. In 1948, when the Truman administration sought to reinstate peacetime draft registration, Howard cast a vote against it. In the political climate of that era, it was a position that came with a price. He believed that peacetime conscription was a fundamental threat to the civil liberties of American citizens. Most of his fellow party members, most of his voters, did not see it that way. He cast that vote and then lost his seat in that year's election. But he had no regrets. He never asked, "What will people think?" He only asked, "Is this the right thing to do?" Growing up watching his father live this way, Warren Buffett absorbed that inner scorecard deep into the logic of every decision he would ever make. When Boesky stood at that podium in 1986, preaching his philosophy of greed, his external scorecard read a perfect score: applause, wealth, envious eyes fixed upon him. But on his internal scorecard, he had already failed long ago. Buffett's restraint was not about suppressing desire. That distinction matters enormously. Suppressing desire means forcing yourself not to think about it, not to want it. Restraint means knowing what you want, knowing how to get it, and yet choosing a longer path to get there. He was greedy in the RJR Nabisco arbitrage, went all in with a heavy bet on Coca-Cola, combing through Arcada's annual reports inch by inch, uncovering hidden value that no one else had seen. None of that was restraint. That was greed, fully unleashed. But this greed was kept in check by one solid guardrail: stay within what you can truly understand. Stay within the boundaries that the rules have drawn. Only do the things that you could explain clearly, standing in front of a mirror. This guardrail came half from Graham and half from Charlie Munger. Munger was Buffett's partner of 40 years. They first met in 1959 at a dinner party in Omaha, and from there became business partners and the closest of confidants. Munger did something very important. He changed how Buffett defined a good deal. Graham's approach was to find companies that were cheap enough that even if the company itself is mediocre, the margin of safety would still keep you from losing money. These kinds of companies have a fitting nickname: cigar butts. Like a cigarette butt picked up off the ground, it may be nearly finished, but there's still one last puff left, and it's free. You might as well take that last puff. But Munger proposed a fundamental upgrade. It's far better to buy a wonderful company at a fair price than to buy a fair company at a wonderful price is far better. This idea sounds simple, but it fundamentally shifted the entire starting point of his investment philosophy. A mediocre business, even when bought cheap, is still a mediocre business. Its competitive edge gets eaten away, its profits get carved up, and in the end, all you're left with is that last drag on a cigarette butt. A truly outstanding business, one with a genuine moat, only strengthens its competitive position over time. The longer you hold it, the greater your returns. That is the logic behind Coca-Cola. Graham's Buffett would most likely never have moved so aggressively into Coca-Cola at that price. In 1988, it simply wasn't cheap enough. But under Munger's influence, Buffett bought. Because what he saw wasn't, is the price low enough? It was, is the moat wide enough? This guardrail gave his greed a more precise direction. In 1965, Buffett took over Berkshire Hathaway. At the time, it was a near-bankrupt textile mill in New England. He gained controlling interest at an average price of roughly $14.86 per share. He quickly realized that the textile business itself was a terrible one. He began redeploying the profits into insurance, banking, and high-quality consumer goods. For the next nearly 60 years, he never wavered from that same logic. Only bet on what you truly understand, and only stay in what you truly understand. In 2023, Berkshire Hathaway's annual report opened its very first page with a set of numbers. From 1965 to 2023, Berkshire's annualized growth in per-share value came in at 19.8%. Over the same period, the S&P 500 delivered an annualized return of 10.2%. Two numbers, the gap doesn't look that big, is 9.6 percentage points. But the power of compounding is a function of time. $1,000 put into Berkshire in 1965 would be worth roughly $35 million by 2023. The same $1,000 invested in the S&P 500 would be worth around $230,000 by 2023, a 150-fold difference. Not because Buffett was the smartest man in the room every single year, but because every single year he stayed on this side of the line. In 2008, the global financial crisis struck. Lehman Brothers came crashing down in September. Wall Street was in ruins, and financial institutions were sounding alarms one after another. On October 16th, Buffett published an article in the New York Times with the headline, "Buy American, I Am." In the article he wrote, "There is a simple rule that guides my buying. Be fearful when others are greedy, and be greedy when others are fearful." The days after the article was published were when fear was at its peak. He injected $5 billion into Goldman Sachs, acquiring preferred shares with a 10% annual yield, along with warrants attached. He extended a similar lifeline of $3 billion to General Electric. Both investments were made when everyone else was fleeing in panic, and what he earned went far beyond the interest alone. This is what he means by be greedy when others are fearful. It wasn't about gambling on luck or ignoring risk. It was that he saw clearly the true value of Goldman Sachs and GE, and understood that the market panic at the time had gone too far, then made the decision that others lacked the courage to make. Charlie Munger once said, "What you need is not to be smarter than everyone else, but to be more disciplined than everyone else." And discipline, it isn't something you're born with. It is a choice made anew every single day, at every decision point. Boesky once had the chance to take a different path. So did Milken. They chose a different path, and that path took them exactly where it was always going to take them. In this episode, we talked about 3 people, 1 tool, and 1 line. The tool is called greed. The line is called boundaries. Three people, all hungry for wealth, all sharp enough, all fully aware of where that line was drawn. One of them crossed it and ended up in prison. One person slipped through the cracks, paid a price of 30 years, was eventually pardoned but could never go back to who he once was. One man stopped, then kept walking, going further and further down that road. Greed is instinct, but restraint is a choice. At the end of this story, there is a question I want to leave with you. Not where is that line? That we already know. But rather, when we see it, are we willing to stop? Or rather, when faced with the prospect of potentially high returns, are you willing to pause and reflect on your original intentions? Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. I'm Fanko. See you in the next episode.